Welcome to Level 3 of the Zscaler ZTA course. Let's master Advanced Zero Trust. In the previous module, we covered the foundations of cybersecurity in the Zero Trust model and explored the primary protection engines: malware protection, advanced threat protection, cloud sandbox, and IPS. In this module, we go deeper. We're now going to explore 5 advanced capabilities that extend the Zero Trust exchange beyond basic threat prevention: deception, identity threat detection and response, private app protection, browser isolation, and detection and response. These aren't isolated point products. Each one shares the same identity, device posture, and application context that runs across the entire Zero Trust exchange, and they integrate with each other to create a layered, adaptive defense. By the end of this module, you'll understand not only what each capability does, but how they work together to detect, contain, and respond to advanced threats. Most security tools are reactive in some sense. They inspect traffic, match signatures, analyze behavior, but they're waiting for something to happen and then trying to identify it. Deception turns this around. Instead of waiting for attackers to touch real assets and hoping the signals are strong enough to detect, deception proactively places attractive but entirely fake assets throughout the environment: credentials, servers, applications, configuration files, and waits for attackers to interact with them. Here's why this is so powerful. Decoys have no legitimate business use. No real user, no real process, no authorized system should ever interact with them. So when something does interact with a decoy, you don't need to do threat analysis to determine if it's suspicious. It is suspicious by definition. That's what gives deception its extremely low false positive rate. Every alert is meaningful. The 3 primary objectives of deception align directly with the attack lifecycle we covered in the previous module. First, detecting compromised users. Attackers who've stolen credentials will try to use them, and if those credentials are decoys, the authentication attempt is immediately visible. Second, preventing lateral movement. Decoy servers distract attackers away from real assets, and every interaction generates an alert that can trigger containment. Third, capturing attacker tactics, techniques, and procedures. Detailed behavioral telemetry about what attackers do inside the environment is invaluable for improving preventive controls and hunting for similar activity. Deception is particularly effective against human-operated ransomware, the kind where a skilled attacker manually navigates through an environment over hours or days before deploying their payload. Those attackers do reconnaissance. They enumerate services, look for credentials, test access paths. Every one of those reconnaissance activities is an opportunity for deception to catch. And critically, deception does not replace preventive controls like IPS, ADP, or private app protection. It adds a detection layer that converts attacker reconnaissance into high-confidence signals. Let's look at the specific techniques deception uses and understand how each type of decoy works. Decoy assets are fake servers, applications, network shares, and services that are indistinguishable from real resources from an attacker's perspective. They're strategically placed across network segments, cloud environments, and identity stores, wherever an attacker performing reconnaissance is likely to look. They're designed to appear attractive. A fake file server, a fake domain controller, a fake internal web application. The attacker doesn't know they're fake. Any attempt to access them generates an immediate, high-fidelity alert. Alongside the decoys themselves, lures are used to draw attackers toward them. A lure might be a fake configuration file that appears to contain database connection strings or documentation that references an internal server, but the server referenced is a decoy. Attackers find these lures during reconnaissance and follow them, which leads them straight into the detection trap. Credential decoys are one of the most powerful techniques because credential harvesting is so common in modern attacks. Fake usernames, passwords, and API keys are seeded directly onto endpoints, in configuration files, in directories where attackers commonly look for secrets. Things like environment files, scheduled task configurations, and IT automation scripts. If an attacker harvests these credentials and attempts to use them, The authentication requests are routed to decoy services that record everything about the attempt. The attacker thinks they've found real credentials. They haven't, and now you know exactly who has them. Application decoys simulate critical business infrastructure, database servers, domain controllers, internal dashboards. They're fully instrumented for detection. Any connection attempt, any authentication, any command execution generates detailed telemetry about what the attacker is doing. This is particularly useful for understanding attacker tooling and lateral movement patterns. Real-time alerting ties it all together. Every interaction with a decoy generates an alert through the Zscaler administration portal and can be forwarded to any SIEM or SOAR platform via integrations. Because decoys have zero legitimate use, the SOC doesn't have to triage whether an alert is real. They already know it is. The question is just what to do about it. And beyond just alerting, deception captures behavioral detail. What commands were run, what tools were used, what lateral movement paths were attempted. This is forensic quality evidence generated without any attacker awareness. Understanding deception's value in isolation is one thing, but understanding how it integrates with the rest of the Zero Trust Exchange is what makes it truly powerful. When a decoy is triggered, the response isn't just an alert. The event can drive real-time policy changes across ZIA and ZPA. A suspected compromised user can have their access immediately restricted, additional authentication required, certain applications blocked, all automatically, before a human analyst has even looked at the alert. That's containment happening in seconds. When an identity decoy is touched, a fake credential is used, the finding flows into ITDR, which adjusts the risk score for that identity. This influences access decisions across the platform. A high-risk identity might be forced into step-up authentication or blocked from sensitive applications entirely. Behavioral data captured by deception feeds into SIEM and SOAR platforms for automated response workflows. And the lateral movement paths an attacker attempts inform ZPA segmentation policy. If an attacker tried to reach a certain application segment, that tells you something about how your segmentation is configured and where you might need to tighten access rules. From a SOC perspective, the three most important use cases are ransomware early detection. Ransomware operators don't just encrypt files immediately. They spend time in the environment first, running reconnaissance, establishing persistence, understanding the network. That reconnaissance is exactly when deception catches them. An alert fires during the recon phase, before any encryption has started. That's the difference between a contained incident and a catastrophic outage. Insider threat identification. If an employee is deliberately trying to access resources they shouldn't, they'll encounter decoys just like an external attacker would. Any interaction is inherently suspicious, and because the credential or asset they accessed was fake, there's no ambiguity about intent. Segmentation validation. You can use deception to validate that your ZPA and network segmentation is working correctly. Place decoys in sensitive segments. If anything from an unauthorized segment ever reaches them, you have a policy gap to fix. It turns deception into a continuous audit tool. And to make the automation picture concrete, a typical SOAR playbook triggered by a deception alert might automatically disable the suspicious account, trigger EDR to isolate the endpoint, and open an incident ticket in ServiceNow, all within seconds of the decoy interaction. No analyst action required for the initial containment. Now let's shift to identity threat detection and response, ITDR. If deception focuses on catching attackers in the act, ITDR focuses on the identity infrastructure itself. The fundamental insight behind ITDR is this. In modern attacks, identity is the most targeted layer. Over 80% of breaches involve compromised credentials in some form. Active Directory, which still underpins identity management in the vast majority of enterprise environments, is a primary target. Compromise Active Directory, and you have broad control over users, devices, and systems across the organization. That's why identity has to be treated as a security surface, not just an authentication service. ITDR in the Zero Trust Exchange continuously monitors identity infrastructure for three categories of risk. What it monitors: Active Directory configurations and changes, clear text passwords stored on endpoints, suspicious use of privileged accounts, anomalous login patterns that deviate from established baselines, overprivileged accounts and groups that violate least privilege principles, and weak delegation or trust relationships. What it detects: compromised or exposed credentials, stale privileged accounts that accumulate access over time without review, insecure cross-domain trust relationships, suspicious changes to group policy objects and group memberships, identity misconfigurations that create privilege escalation paths, and lateral movement attempts via credential abuse. What it does in response: it generates prioritized findings that security teams can act on immediately, forcing password resets, revoking group memberships, updating Zscaler access policies. It can enforce MFA through integrations with identity providers. And critically, it feeds all of this into Risk 360, the Zscaler risk management layer, providing a quantified, correlated view of identity risk. The key role of IDDR and Zero Trust is this: access decisions in ZPA and ZIA are based partly on identity. If that identity is compromised or overprivileged, those access decisions are wrong. IDR ensures that the identity pillar of Zero Trust remains trustworthy. Let's go deeper on 3 specific IDDR capabilities: Active Directory risk detection, automated remediation, and Risk 360 integration. Active Directory risk detection is one of IDDR's most critical functions because AD is so frequently targeted. IDDR looks for a specific set of high-risk conditions that attackers routinely exploit: weak Kerberos delegation settings that allow delegation abuse, insecure cross-domain trust relationships, stale privileged accounts, accounts that were added to domain admins months or years ago and never reviewed, unauthorized or unexpected changes to group policy objects, ASREP roastable accounts, accounts configured without Kerberos pre-authentication, which can be attacked offline to crack passwords, Kerberoastable service accounts with weak passwords, which attackers routinely target to gain privileged access. ITDR continuously scans for all of these, providing a real-time picture of AD risk posture. Automated remediation is where ITDR transitions from detection to action. When compromised credentials are found, ITDR can trigger account disablement through integrations with identity providers. When MFA isn't enforced for high-risk accounts, ITDR can trigger enforcement. When ZPA access policies need updating to reflect newly discovered risky identities, ITDR drives those updates automatically. This automation is essential in large environments where there might be hundreds of findings per day. Manual response to each one is simply not feasible. Risk 360 cross-coverage is how ITDR contributes to organizational risk posture beyond its own domain. Identity risk findings from ITDR are correlated with other risk dimensions in Risk 360: data exposure, external attack surface, vulnerability posture. This cross-correlation lets security leaders prioritize remediation based on combined impact and likelihood. An exposed credential matters more if it belongs to an account with access to sensitive data, and there's also a known vulnerability in the application that account accesses. Risk 360 can surface that intersection. And for governance and compliance, Risk 360 maps these identity risk metrics to frameworks like NIST CSF and ISO 27001, supporting audit readiness and demonstrating zero trust control maturity over time. Now let's turn to private app protection. This capability brings application layer security to private applications accessed through ZPA, filling a gap that traditional web application firewalls leave wide open. To understand private app protection, you first need to understand what a traditional WAF does and where it falls short. A traditional WAF sits at the network perimeter and inspects HTTP and HTTPS traffic flowing to public-facing applications. It blocks attacks like cross-site scripting, SQL injection, and remote code execution at the edge. It works reasonably well for public applications. But what about private applications? Applications that run inside the corporate network or in private cloud environments. Internal dashboards, custom line-of-business applications, Legacy systems, internal APIs? A perimeter WAF doesn't protect those. And as organizations adopt ZPA for zero trust access to private apps, those applications need their own layer of application layer security. That's exactly what private app protection provides. And the way it works in the zero trust model is fundamentally different from a tradition. Only authenticated, authorized traffic gets inspected. This dramatically reduces the volume of traffic requiring deep inspection compared to a perimeter WAF. And because private app protection is part of the Zscaler platform, it has access to the same identity and device posture context that ZPA uses. Policies can be differentiated based on user role, device compliance status, and risk level, something a standalone WAF appliance simply can't do. Let's walk through the specific attack types that private app protection defends against, and then discuss the important concept of virtual patching. Cross-site scripting, XSS, is an attack where malicious JavaScript is injected into web pages or application responses, where it then executes in the browsers of users visiting those pages. Private app protection inspects HTTP requests and responses for injected script content in form fields, query strings, headers, and payloads. When it detects malicious script patterns, it can block or sanitize the request before it reaches the application backend. This is particularly important for applications that display user-generated content. SQL injection is one of the most common and dangerous web application vulnerabilities. It works by inserting malicious SQL syntax into user input fields, login forms, search boxes, URL parameters, in a way that manipulates the database query on the backend. Private app protection detects these patterns in real time and blocks them. For legacy or custom-built applications that may not have been built with parameterized queries or modern input validation, this is often the only compensating control standing between the application and complete database compromise. Remote code execution attacks attempt to run arbitrary code on application servers by exploiting vulnerabilities in how the application handles input, particularly in deserialization routines or file upload handlers. These are among the most severe vulnerabilities because successful exploitation typically leads to complete server compromise. Private app protection monitors for request patterns and payloads known to trigger RCE vulnerabilities, blocking them before they reach the application. Cookie poisoning is an attack that attempts to modify session cookies or other stateful data transmitted between client and server, escalating privileges, impersonating other users, or bypassing authentication checks. Private app protection enforces integrity checks on cookie structures and validates their content, preventing tampering. Now, virtual patching. This is one of the most operationally valuable concepts in application security, and it's worth spending a moment on it. When a new vulnerability is discovered in an application, the ideal response is to patch the application code. In reality, patching takes time, especially for legacy applications or complex systems where code changes require extensive testing, approval processes, and potentially service windows. That window between when a vulnerability is discovered and when it's patched is a period of real exposure. Virtual patching means that private app protection can enforce a mitigation for a known vulnerability at the inspection layer, even before the underlying application code is fixed. It doesn't change the application. It intercepts and blocks the specific exploit pattern that targets the vulnerability. This dramatically shrinks the exposure window and reduces the pressure on development teams for emergency patches. Browser isolation, also called remote browser isolation or RBI, solves a fundamental problem with web browsing. The fact that web pages today are active, executable content, not passive documents. When a user visits a website, their browser downloads HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and potentially plugins or active content, and then executes all of it locally on their device. That's the architecture of the modern web, and it's also the attack surface that drive-by downloads, exploit kits, malvertising, and zero-day browser exploits all rely on. Traditional approaches to this problem are binary: block the site entirely, or allow access and hope the endpoint security catches anything malicious. Neither is satisfying. Blocking too aggressively harms productivity. Allowing access puts endpoints at risk. Browser isolation takes a third path. Instead of rendering web content on the endpoint or blocking it entirely, the content is executed in an ephemeral browser running in the Zscaler cloud. The remote browser fetches the page, runs all the JavaScript, executes all the active content, but none of that execution happens on the user's device. The user receives only a pixel stream, a visual representation of the rendered page. Mouse clicks and keystrokes are transmitted back to the cloud browser to enable interaction, but active content never touches the endpoint. The security implications are dramatic. Even if a website is hosting an exploit kit, zero-day browser vulnerability, or malicious JavaScript, it doesn't matter because that code is running in an isolated cloud environment, not on the user's device. Drive-by downloads cannot reach the endpoint unless explicitly allowed by policy. Sessions are ephemeral. When the session ends, the cloud browser is destroyed, taking any compromise with it. From a policy perspective, browser isolation is triggered automatically based on configurable criteria. URL categories, page risk scores, newly registered domains, user groups, or specific destinations defined as high risk. So users don't have to do anything differently. If their browsing request triggers an isolation policy, it's transparently routed through the cloud browser. Let's look at the practical use cases for browser isolation and understand how pixel streaming actually works. The first and most common use case is safe access to untrusted or uncategorized sites. Organizations constantly face this tension. Blocking an uncategorized site might be blocking something legitimate that a user legitimately needs. But allowing access to an uncategorized site exposes the endpoint to unknown risk. Browser isolation resolves this tension perfectly. You can allow access while eliminating the risk of active content reaching the endpoint. The user gets what they need, the organization gets protection. The second use case is security research and investigation. Security analysts, threat hunters, and incident responders often need to visit potentially malicious sites to investigate an indicator of compromise, to analyze a phishing domain, to understand an attack campaign. Without isolation, doing this safely requires a dedicated sandboxed virtual machine with no access to corporate resources. With browser isolation, analysts can investigate from their normal workstation. Any active content stays in the cloud. The third use case is BYOD and mixed device environments. When employees use personal devices or devices with varying levels of endpoint protection, browser isolation removes the dependency on endpoint security for web threat prevention. Even on an unmanaged device with no corporate endpoint agent, browsing sessions routed through isolation are protected by the cloud browser. Now, let's look at how pixel streaming works in practice. When an isolated session is active, the Zscaler cloud browser fetches and fully renders the web page, including all HTML, CSS, and JavaScript execution. The user sees a visual representation of that page, streamed as pixels to their local browser. For interactive browsing, mouse events and keystrokes are transmitted back to the cloud browser to enable navigation. For documents, Word files, PDFs, policies can convert them to safe formats and display them within the isolated session, preventing any embedded macros or scripts from executing. The granular policy controls are worth highlighting. Administrators can configure exactly when to allow file downloads from isolated sessions, when to strip active content, and when to block transfers entirely. This flexibility allows different risk profiles for different users or destinations. Finally, integration. Browser isolation doesn't operate independently. When ADP or the page risk engine determines a site is suspicious but not definitively malicious, the policy can direct traffic to isolation while ADP and Cloud Sandbox continue to inspect any files requested within the session. DLP policies are also enforced within isolated sessions. Users can't upload sensitive data to untrusted sites, and they can't copy content out of isolated windows. So browser isolation provides protection in both directions, against inbound threats from malicious content and against outbound data exfiltration through untrusted web destinations. We've now covered deception, IDDR, private app protection, and browser isolation. Let's bring it all together with detection and response. The capability that correlates signals from all of these engines and the rest of the Zscaler platform into actionable, high-fidelity intelligence for SOC teams. Think about the challenge a SOC analyst faces in a medium to large organization. Thousands of security events per day or per hour. Individual events that might look benign in isolation. Multi-stage attacks that unfold over hours or days, with each individual event generating only a low-severity flag. Without correlation, the signal is buried in noise. Detection and response solves this by operating as a correlation engine that continuously ingests security logs from across the Zscaler platform. Web events, firewall events, DNS events, sandbox results, deception alerts, IDDR findings, and applies correlation rules, machine learning, and ThreatLabz threat intelligence to identify patterns indicative of real attacks. The telemetry sources feed into a central correlation engine. That engine uses AI, ML, and ThreatLabz-derived rules to group related events into cohesive threat narratives, campaigns. Each alert that comes out of the correlation engine is not a single event. It's a group collection of related events that collectively tell a story about an ongoing attack. Critically, every alert is mapped to MITRE ATT and CK tactics and techniques. That mapping is valuable for two reasons. First, it tells the SOC analyst immediately where in the kill chain the attack is occurring. Are we at initial access, lateral movement, exfiltration? Second, it guides the response. Different stages of the kill chain require different containment actions. The outputs of the correlation engine flow to 5 downstream capabilities: high-fidelity alerts, MITRE map threat intelligence, SIEM and SOAR integration, automated remediation, and threat hunting context. The goal, stated simply, is to reduce alert fatigue by presenting analysts with a small number of high-priority, context-rich alerts rather than thousands of atomic events. Quality over quantity, so analysts can focus on what matters. Let's go deeper on how the correlation engine works and how SOC teams actually use detection and response in their daily workflows. The correlation engine has 4 key capabilities. Campaign grouping is the most fundamental. It takes individual events, a phishing page visit, a malicious document download, a sandbox detonation, C2 traffic, and groups all of them into a single campaign alert. Instead of 3 or 4 low-severity events that might get missed individually, you get one high-severity campaign alert that presents the complete picture. MITRE ATT and CK mapping is applied automatically to every alert. This is more than just a label. It means that the moment a SOC analyst opens an alert, they already know which techniques the attacker used and which phase of the kill chain is active. That context dramatically accelerates triage. Alert severity tuning allows organizations to calibrate the system to their risk tolerance and asset criticality. High-severity alerts can be configured to trigger immediate automated notifications via email, webhook, Slack, Teams, PagerDuty, or OpsGenie, ensuring the right people know immediately. ThreatLabz enrichment adds threat context automatically. Malware family name, known campaign associations, attacker infrastructure details, and related IOCs. An analyst looking at a campaign alert doesn't just see what happened on their network. They see what this malware family typically does next, what infrastructure it's known to use, and what other indicators they should hunt for. For threat hunting and triage, detection and response provides a drill-down investigation experience. From a campaign alert, analysts can explore the underlying events and timeline, see all affected users and devices, and pivot to raw logs for deeper investigation. Crucially, they can also hunt laterally. If one user visited a malicious domain, were any other users also contacting that domain? If one device downloaded the same malware sample, are there other devices with the same file? For SIEM and SOAR integration, detection and response supports log streaming via Zscaler's Nanolog streaming service and log streaming service to platforms including Splunk, Microsoft Sentinel, IBM QRadar, Sumo Logic, and others. This allows organizations to correlate Zscaler telemetry with data from endpoint, identity, and cloud sources in their existing SIEM. SOAR automation closes the loop by turning alerts into automated response actions. A high-severity campaign alert might trigger a playbook that creates a ServiceNow incident, blocks associated domains in ZA via API call, triggers EDR to isolate affected endpoints, and notifies on-call staff, all within the same minute the alert fires. Let's make this concrete with one of the most common real-world use cases: detecting and responding to a TrickBot or Emotet campaign. These are modular banking malware families that have been used for years as a delivery mechanism for ransomware. They're good examples because they exhibit all the multi-stage behaviors that the detection and response correlation engine is designed to catch. Here's how a typical campaign detection unfolds. It starts with a user visiting a newly registered domain used in an Emotet phishing campaign. ADP catches this, since newly registered domains are treated as high risk. The user is presented with a malicious document download. File type control flags the .doc attachment, and Cloud Sandbox detonates it, identifying the macro dropper inside. During detonation, the sandbox observes the sample reaching out to known TrickBot command and control infrastructure. An IOC is confirmed. All three of these events, the phishing visit, the malicious download, and the C2 traffic, are now correlated into a single campaign alert. The alert includes MITRE ATT and CK mappings for phishing and command and control, the affected user and device, a timeline, and ThreatLabz campaign intelligence about TrickBot behavior and typical next steps. The SOC analyst opens this single alert instead of three separate low-severity events. They immediately see patient 0, the specific user and device where the infection chain started. They can assess spread. Were other users contacted with the same phishing domain? Are any other devices talking to the same C2 infrastructure? And then they initiate containment, either manually or through an automated SOAR playbook. The automated remediation workflow follows a logical sequence. The high-severity alert fires. A SOAR playbook is triggered. An incident ticket is automatically created in ServiceNow or Jira and assigned to on-call staff. The C2 and phishing domains associated with the campaign are blocked in ZIA via API call. EDR isolates the affected endpoint from the network, and the affected user's credentials are disabled, and MFA enforcement is triggered. All of this happening within seconds of the alert. The operational impact is significant. Mean time to respond drops from hours. When a human analyst has to manually piece together events, build the attack narrative, and orchestrate multiple containment actions, to minutes with automated correlation, enrichment, and response. And because the response is codified in playbooks, it's consistent every time, not dependent on which analyst happens to be on duty. Let's close with a summary of all 5 advanced capabilities and how they fit together. Deception is your early warning system inside the environment. It catches attackers during reconnaissance and lateral movement, the phase between initial compromise and final objective, through decoy assets, credential lures, and application decoys. Any interaction is a high-confidence alert. It feeds detection signals into ZIA/ZPA policy, ITDR, and SIEM/SOAR for immediate containment. ITDR protects the identity layer, the foundation of zero-trust access decisions. It continuously monitors Active Directory for misconfigurations, exposed credentials, and overprivilege. It automates remediation through integrations with identity providers and EDR tools. And it feeds identity risk into Risk 360 for a comprehensive, cross-correlated view of organizational risk. Private App Protection brings application layer security to private applications accessed through ZPA. Inline inspection for XSS, SQL injection, remote code execution, and cookie poisoning. Operating within the zero-trust context, so only authenticated, authorized traffic is inspected. Virtual patching capabilities reduce the exposure window for known vulnerabilities, providing a critical compensating control for legacy and complex applications. Browser isolation executes web content in the cloud and streams only safe pixels to endpoints. It neutralizes drive-by downloads and zero-day browser exploits without blocking access. It integrates with ADP, Sandbox, and DLP to provide protection against both inbound threats and outbound data flows. It's especially valuable for BYOD, research workflows, and access to uncategorized or risky sites. Detection and response ties everything together. It continuously ingests telemetry from all Zscaler engines, correlates related events into high-fidelity campaign alerts, enriches them with ThreatLab intelligence and MITRE ATT and CK mappings, and drives automated SOAR remediation workflows. The result? MTTR measured in minutes rather than hours. All 5 capabilities share the same identity, device posture, and application context that runs across the Zero Trust Exchange. That unified context is what makes the platform greater than the sum of its parts, enabling precise, adaptive, and automated security for every user accessing every application from anywhere. Thank you for completing this module. These advanced capabilities are important exam topics for the Zscaler certifications, so make sure you understand not just what each one does, but how they integrate with each other and with the broader Zero Trust Exchange.